After dedicating 8 years to transforming my mother's struggling textile company into a $30 million enterprise, she gathered our family for dinner at her estate. Raising her glass with a practiced smile, she announced, "James will be taking over as CEO next month." My younger brother, who had spent the last decade bouncing between failed startups in Silicon Valley, looked as surprised as I felt. I maintained my composure, nodding professionally while feeling everything I'd built crumbling beneath me. What my mother didn't realize was that I had prepared for this moment long before she ever considered it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dining room of my mother's colonial-style estate had always been a place of family ceremonies, birthdays, holiday gatherings, and the quarterly family business dinners that had become tradition since I took over operations at Reynolds Fabrics. That evening, the space was meticulously arranged as always. The antique mahogany table set with the heirloom china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier overhead, and arrangements of fresh-cut flowers from her prized garden. The familiar setting made what happened all the more jarring. I should have noticed the signs earlier. My mother, Eleanor Reynolds, had been unusually insistent about everyone's attendance. Even James, who typically found excuses to miss these gatherings. The executive team had been excluded for the first time in years. There was an air of anticipation. I had misinterpreted as excitement about our recent expansion into sustainable textiles. We had just finished the main course, her chef's signature coq au vin, when she gently tapped her knife against her crystal glass. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward the head of the table. At 68, my mother still commanded, attention with her perfect posture and penetrating gaze, silver hair immaculately styled, her expression revealing nothing until she chose to speak. "Before dessert, I'd like to make an announcement about the future of Reynolds Fabrics," she began, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd used in boardrooms for decades before stepping back into an advisory role. "As you all know, Catherine has done remarkable work expanding our operations over the past 8 years. A few relatives nodded in agreement. I felt a momentary warmth at the acknowledgement, quickly followed by an inexplicable sense of dread at the word has, rather than is doing. Under her leadership, we've seen unprecedented growth, reaching markets we once thought unattainable. My mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she continued. However, every company reaches inflection points where fresh perspectives become necessary for continued evolution. I felt the air leaving my lungs slowly, my hand tightening around the stem of my wine glass as realization dawned. This wasn't a celebration, it was a transition announcement. After considerable reflection and discussion with our advisory board, I've decided that James will be taking over as CEO next month. The silence that followed was deafening. Across the table, my brother James looked momentarily startled before composing his features into what I recognized as his investor pitch expression. Confident, slightly humble, practiced. Had he known this was coming? The slight tension around his eyes suggested perhaps not, at least not the public announcement method. My cousin Eliza, who headed our design department, shot me a look of stunned disbelief. My Aunt Margaret, always quick with opinions, was for once speechless. My uncle, Lawrence, who had fought my initial appointment years ago, couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. 8 years. 8 years of 16-hour days transforming a regional textile manufacturer on the brink of bankruptcy into an industry leader with global distribution channels. 8 years of sacrificed relationships, missed vacations, and postponed personal goals. 8 years of proving myself in an industry that had initially dismissed me as Eleanor's daughter playing businesswoman. 8 years of results that spoke for themselves, revenue growth from $3 million to $30 million, workforce expansion from 48 employees to over 300, and a reputation for innovation that had made Reynolds Fabrics the supplier of choice for luxury brands across 3 continents. And now, In the space of a single sentence, my mother had determined it was time for my brother to step in and reap the rewards. James, who had spent the past decade cycling through tech startups in California, none lasting more than 18 months. James, who had visited our manufacturing facilities exactly twice in 8 years. James, who still needed the family name to secure meetings with investors after 3 failed ventures. I maintained my composure, years of negotiating with demanding clients having taught me the value of an unreadable expression. My fingers relaxed around the wine glass as I deliberately set it down, straightened my shoulders, and offered what appeared to be a gracious smile. "That's quite an announcement," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "May I ask what prompted this decision?" The question was professionally framed, as though I were inquiring about a standard business strategy adjustment rather than my own removal. My mother's expression remained unchanged, though I noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, a tell I'd learned to recognize during childhood when she was preparing to enforce an unpopular decision. The board and I believe diversification is crucial for our next growth phase. James's experience in the technology sector brings valuable perspective as we expand our smart textile division. She gestured toward my brother. His connections in Silicon Valley will open doors to partnerships we currently lack access to. It was a practiced response, likely rehearsed with the same advisory board that had always deferred to her judgment. What remained unspoken was the family's unwritten rule: Reynolds businesses were ultimately meant to be led by Reynolds men. My appointment had always been viewed by certain family members as temporary, a necessary deviation during crisis, never intended as permanent. James cleared his throat. "I'm looking forward to building on Catherine's foundation," he offered, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by acknowledging my contributions. "There's tremendous potential in integrating technology with traditional textiles." The conversation shifted to implementation details, the announcement to employees, the transition timeline, James's onboarding schedule. I participated appropriately, offering insights where requested, maintaining the facade of cooperative leadership transition while my mind worked several steps ahead. What no one at that table knew, what my mother had never bothered to investigate, was that I had anticipated this moment from the day I stepped into the CEO role. While turning around the company, I had systematically embedded myself into its operational infrastructure in ways that would be impossible to untangle without my cooperation. While expanding our market presence, I had cultivated relationships with key clients that were personal, not institutional. While modernizing our manufacturing processes, I had secured patents in my name, then licensed them to Reynolds Fabrics under very specific conditions. As the evening progressed, dessert was served, my mother's favorite lemon tart, and conversation drifted to family matters. I participated just enough to avoid appearing withdrawn, all while calculating my next moves with the same methodical precision I'd applied to saving the company years earlier. When the gathering concluded, family members departed with awkward embraces and whispered comments of surprise or encouragement. My mother pulled me aside in the foyer, her hand resting on my arm in the familiar gesture that had preceded difficult conversations throughout my life. "Catherine, I know this is unexpected," she began, her tone softening slightly. "But James needs this opportunity. The Reynolds name should continue leading the company, and he's the future of the family." The unspoken implication hung between us. At 36 and unmarried, I had failed to produce the next generation of Reynolds leadership. James, despite his professional shortcomings, had managed to marry and father 2 children who carried the family name. "I understand business decisions require difficult choices," I replied neutrally, using one of her own frequent phrases. "We'll discuss transition details at the office tomorrow." As I drove away from the estate, streetlights illuminating the familiar path I'd traveled countless times between my mother's home and my downtown apartment, I felt an unexpected calm settling over me. This wasn't the devastating blow they anticipated. This was merely the opening move in a game I had been preparing for since I first recognized the conditional nature of my leadership. Tomorrow, my mother and brother would learn exactly what it meant to attempt to remove someone who had not just run the company, but had strategically positioned herself to be indispensable to its continued success. They thought tonight was an ending. They had no idea it was merely the beginning of a recalibration that would permanently change the power dynamics of Reynolds Fabrics and our family forever. 8 years before that fateful dinner, I stood in the main production floor of Reynolds Fabrics, surrounded by silent looms and empty workstations. The once bustling facility that had employed 3 generations of local families was eerily quiet, with only the occasional drip from a leaking roof breaking the silence. This 40,000 square foot space, once the pride of my grandfather when he expanded operations in the 1970s, now stood as a monument to industrial decline. Reynolds Fabrics had been founded in 1953 by my grandfather, William Reynolds, initially producing upholstery materials for the booming post-war furniture industry. Under his leadership, the company developed a reputation for quality and reliability, if not innovation. When my mother Eleanor took over in the mid-1980s after his unexpected heart attack, she brought a new vision focused on higher-end decorative textiles. For 2 decades, Reynolds thrived, expanding to 3 production facilities and employing over 200 people at its peak. But the company had failed to adapt to globalization. Cheaper imports began flooding the market in the early 2000s. By 2010, Reynolds was facing growing losses, and by 2015, the company was in serious trouble, operating at 30% capacity, carrying significant debt, and rapidly losing its remaining clients to overseas competitors with lower prices. I hadn't planned on joining the family business. After graduating with my MBA from Northwestern, I had built a promising career in product development at a major consumer goods corporation in Chicago. My path seemed set. I was being groomed for executive leadership, had just purchased my first condo, and was engaged to be married to Thomas, another rising corporate star. Then came the call from my mother. "It's worse than we thought," she admitted, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "The bank is threatening to call our loans. We have maybe 6 months before we'll need to consider bankruptcy options." I had flown home that weekend, intending only to review the financials and perhaps suggest some consultants who might help develop a turnaround strategy. Instead, I found a company in free fall: outdated products, demoralized employees, antiquated manufacturing processes, and a leadership team populated by my mother's loyal friends rather than industry experts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "What about James?" I had asked during a tense conversation in my mother's office, referring to my brother, who had recently graduated with a computer science degree. "Isn't this why you encouraged him to study business alongside his technical courses?" My mother's expression had darkened. "James has accepted a position with a startup in California. He feels textiles are outdated, not where his future lies." What went unspoken was that my brother, the presumed heir to the Reynolds business legacy, had chosen to pursue trendier opportunities rather than help save the struggling family company. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. I returned to Chicago with a comprehensive understanding of Reynolds' problems and a folder full of financial statements that kept me awake for 3 consecutive nights. The company employed dozens of families who had worked for Reynolds for generations. It was the largest employer in the small town my grandfather had helped build. Its closure would devastate the community. The decision I made changed everything. I walked into my boss's office on Monday morning and resigned from my position. By Friday, I had broken off my engagement to Thomas, who had made it clear he had no interest in relocating to a small manufacturing town. Within 2 weeks, I had sublet my condo and moved back into my old bedroom in my mother's house, ready to attempt what most industry experts would have called impossible. 6 months, I told my mother when I accepted the interim CEO position. I'll give it everything for 6 months. If we can't turn the corner by then, we'll need to consider an orderly wind down. She had agreed, though I suspected even then, that she viewed my commitment as temporary, a dutiful daughter stepping in during crisis, not a permanent leadership solution. The unspoken expectation was that I would stabilize the company until James finished finding himself in Silicon Valley and returned to claim his birthright. Those first months were brutal. I arrived at the factory at 5 a.m. each morning and often didn't leave until midnight. I immersed myself in every aspect of the business, spending days on the production floor learning from longtime employees, nights analyzing market trends and competitor strategies, weekends visiting potential clients to understand their changing needs. The problems were even more severe than initially apparent. Our product line was outdated, focusing on traditional patterns when the market had shifted toward contemporary designs. Our manufacturing equipment, while still functional, required twice the labor hours of modern machinery. Our sales approach relied on relationships with furniture manufacturers who were themselves struggling to survive. The turnaround strategy I developed was radical and risky. Rather than trying to compete with low-cost overseas producers on price, we would shift to specialty textiles that required expertise our competitors couldn't easily replicate. Instead of chasing declining furniture manufacturers, we would target high-end interior designers and boutique hotels willing to pay premium prices for custom solutions. Rather than maintaining all 3 facilities, we would consolidate operations into our main plant and sell the others to generate immediate capital. The execution was painful. We reduced our workforce by 40%, though I implemented this through early retirement offers and severance packages rather than simple layoffs. We sold 2 facilities, using the proceeds to upgrade our remaining plant with modern equipment. We terminated relationships with clients who continually demanded lower prices, focusing instead on partners who valued quality and customization. Most controversially, I made the decision to bring in Daniel Merritt, a textile engineer from a competitor, offering him equity to join our struggling company. My mother had opposed this move. Bringing an outsider into a family business violated her sense of propriety. But Daniel brought expertise in sustainable fibers and digital printing technologies that we desperately needed. "You're giving away part of your inheritance," my mother had warned when I proposed offering Daniel a 5% stake. "I'm ensuring there will be an inheritance to give," I had countered. 6 months stretched into 12 as we fought for survival. There were weeks when I personally guaranteed supplier payments because the company couldn't meet its obligations. There were nights I slept on a cot in my office because driving home would waste valuable hours. There were moments of despair, when key clients canceled orders or essential equipment malfunctioned. But gradually, painfully, things began to change. Our new focus on sustainable luxury textiles caught the attention of an emerging hotel chain committed to environmental responsibility. A well-known interior designer featured our fabrics in a home showcased in Architectural Digest. Our custom, digital printing capabilities attracted fashion brands looking for limited edition materials. By the 18-month mark, Reynolds Fabrics had stopped losing money. By the 2-year anniversary of my return, we were modestly profitable and had begun hiring again, bringing back some of the employees we had reluctantly let go. By year 3, we had repaid the most pressing debts and were expanding into new product categories, including automotive upholstery made from recycled materials, an innovation Daniel had spearheaded. The transformation required constant reinvention. When traditional lending remained unavailable, I developed creative financing solutions, including client prepayments and equipment leasing arrangements. When experienced textile workers proved scarce, I established a training program in partnership with the local community college. When transportation costs threatened margins, I reorganized our supply chain to emphasize regional suppliers. Throughout this period, my personal life remained secondary to company survival. I purchased a small house near the factory, but rarely spent time there. I made few friends outside work and had no serious relationships. My identity became inseparable from Reynolds Fabrics. Its challenges were my challenges, its successes my successes. My mother, who had initially maintained an active advisory role, gradually stepped back as the company stabilized. She expressed pride in the turnaround, but often qualified her praise with reminders that Reynolds women have always been capable managers in times of crisis. The implication was clear. My leadership was viewed as crisis management, not a permanent arrangement. James visited occasionally, usually during holidays when he returned to see our mother. He showed polite interest in the company's progress, but made it clear his true passion remained in technology ventures. During these visits, my mother would inevitably find ways to highlight his technical knowledge, suggesting how valuable it might someday be to company operations. By year 5, Reynolds Fabrics had not merely survived, but begun to thrive. Our workforce had grown to 150 employees, not as many as during the peak years, but these were higher-skilled positions with better compensation. Our revenue had reached $15 million, still below historical highs, but with profit margins double what the company had ever achieved. Most importantly, we had established a reputation for innovation in sustainable luxury textiles that positioned us uniquely in the market. It was during this period that I made a series of decisions that would prove crucial in ways I couldn't yet anticipate. First, I registered several key manufacturing processes as patents under my name personally, licensing them to Reynolds Fabrics. My mother questioned this arrangement, but I explained it as protection against potential creditors, which was partially true. Second, I established direct relationships with our most valuable clients, making myself personally essential to these partnerships, rather than allowing them to be institutional relationships. I became not just a supplier but a trusted advisor on material innovation and sustainability practices. Third, I carefully documented every aspect of the turnaround. The financial investments I had made personally, the hours worked beyond any reasonable compensation, the opportunities foregone to save the family legacy. This documentation was thorough, meticulous, and secured where only I could access it. These measures weren't initially taken out of distrust. They were insurance against uncertainty in a business I had come to love but did not legally control. As Reynolds Fabrics continued its remarkable transformation from failing regional manufacturer to industry innovator, I remained clear-eyed about one fundamental truth. Despite my efforts, my sacrifice, and my success, I was still operating within a family dynamic where tradition often mattered more than results. What I could not have predicted was how quickly that dynamic would assert itself once the crisis had passed and success had been secured, or how thoroughly I had prepared myself for the moment when my mother would finally decide it was time for her son to claim the company I had rebuilt. The turning point for Reynolds Fabrics came during year 6 of my leadership, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. That spring, I attended the International Textile Innovation Conference in Milan, an event I had previously been unable to justify given our tight budgets. Now, with the company stabilized and growing, I could finally participate in the industry's premier gathering. The conference occupied a massive exhibition center on the outskirts of Milan, filled with the latest manufacturing technologies, sustainable fiber innovations, and textile designers from around the world. After years of focusing exclusively on company survival, the immersion in forward-thinking industry trends felt both overwhelming and exhilarating. I was examining a new digital printing system when a voice behind me observed, "Impressive technology, but the integration capabilities are still problematic for mid-sized operations." I turned to find myself face-to-face with Alexander Voss, founder of Voss Ventures, one of the most successful investment firms specializing in manufacturing modernization. In his early 50s, Voss had a reputation for identifying traditional industries ripe for technological transformation. His firm had revitalized companies across multiple sectors, from furniture production to specialized glass manufacturing. Catherine Reynolds, I introduced myself, extending my hand. And you're right about the integration issues. We'd need to rebuild our entire workflow to accommodate this system. His eyebrows raised slightly at the mention of my name. Reynolds, fabrics? I've been following your company's transformation with interest. Not many traditional textile manufacturers have successfully pivoted to sustainable luxury materials while maintaining domestic production. The fact that someone of his stature was aware of our relatively small company caught me by surprise. We've been fortunate to find the right market niche, I replied modestly. Fortune rarely explains sustained growth in manufacturing today, Voss countered. Strategic vision and execution are far more relevant factors. Would you have time for coffee? I'd be interested to hear more about your approach to modernizing a legacy operation. That coffee extended to dinner, which evolved into one of the most stimulating business conversations I'd experienced in years. Unlike local business, leaders who often patronized me as Eleanor's daughter, Voss engaged with my strategies and decisions as worthy of serious analysis. He asked incisive questions about our manufacturing processes, challenged my assumptions about certain market segments, and shared relevant experiences from portfolio companies facing similar transitions. Your company has enormous potential, beyond its current trajectory, he observed as we concluded dinner. Have you considered what growth capital could do for Reynolds at this stage? I had, of course, but external investment had seemed impossible during our struggling years and unnecessary once we stabilized. We're debt-averse after our previous experiences, I explained cautiously. Debt and investment are fundamentally different, Voss replied. The right capital partner brings strategic value beyond money. Market access, technological expertise, operational insights. By the time I returned from Milan, I had agreed to host Voss for a facility tour the following month. I briefed my leadership team extensively, preparing them for the scrutiny of a sophisticated investor. Daniel Merritt, my head of engineering, was particularly enthusiastic about the possibility of accelerating our technical innovations with appropriate funding. My mother, however, responded with characteristic caution when I mentioned the upcoming visit. Outside investors dilute family control, she warned during our monthly lunch. Your grandfather always insisted on maintaining complete ownership, even during difficult periods. Times have changed, I pointed out. The companies thriving today understand strategic partnerships. Besides, we're only exploring possibilities at this stage. Alexander Voss arrived for his visit with little fanfare, dressed in business casual attire that helped him blend in on our production floor. He spent the morning observing operations, speaking directly with line supervisors and machine operators rather than limiting his interactions to management. After lunch, he reviewed our financials and growth projections with a thoroughness that made our regular bank audits seem superficial. You've built something remarkable here, he concluded as we sat in my office late that afternoon. Your operational efficiencies exceed industry standards by approximately 12%. Your employee retention is exceptional, and your materials innovation pipeline is more advanced than competitors 3 times your size. His specific observations demonstrated how seriously he had analyzed our operation. Thank you, I replied. It's been a team effort over several years. That said, he continued, you're operating at perhaps 40% of your potential. Your manufacturing capacity can't meet current demand, your international market penetration is minimal, and your R&D budget constrains innovation that could open entirely new product categories. He wasn't wrong. Despite our successful turnaround, we remained limited by capital constraints. Expansion required equipment investments we couldn't yet afford. International growth needed infrastructure we hadn't built. Material innovations remained partially developed because we couldn't fund extensive testing. Voss Ventures would be interested in making a significant investment in Reynolds Fabrics, he stated directly. We typically acquire minority positions, 30 to 40% in companies with your profile. We provide growth capital, technical expertise, and market access while leaving operational control with the leadership team that has proven successful. The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. The investment would accelerate our growth beyond anything possible through organic expansion, but it would also fundamentally change the ownership structure that had defined Reynolds Fabrics for 3 generations. I'll need to discuss this with our board and family stakeholders, I explained. The board was primarily a formality. It consisted of my mother, myself, my Uncle Lawrence, and 2 long-standing family friends. The real decision-maker was Eleanor Reynolds. Of course, Voss nodded. The family dimension requires careful consideration. But don't take too long. Companies in transition phases like yours either accelerate toward industry leadership or stagnate into obsolescence. There's rarely a stable middle ground in today's market. Before leaving, he handed me a detailed overview of how Voss Ventures had transformed similar companies, complete with case studies, investment structures, and growth metrics. Review these with your team. My office will provide a formal term sheet next week for your consideration. The proposal from Voss Ventures was exceptional. $12 million for a 35% stake, valuing Reynolds Fabrics at approximately $34 million. The investment would fund expansion into European markets, development of our proprietary sustainable fiber technologies, and automation upgrades to triple production capacity. Additionally, Voss would secure 2 board seats while I would remain CEO with operational control. I spent a week preparing a comprehensive presentation for the family board, analyzing the opportunity from every angle. The capital injection would accelerate our growth trajectory by an estimated 5 years. The expertise Voss brought could help us avoid costly mistakes in international expansion. The connections offered access to markets we had struggled to penetrate independently. My mother scheduled the board meeting at her home rather than company headquarters, a clear signal she viewed this as a family matter rather than a business decision. I arrived early to set up my presentation materials in the formal dining room that doubled as our boardroom for such occasions. Before the others arrive, my mother said, closing the door behind her, I want to understand why you're pursuing this. Reynolds has always been family-owned. Your grandfather would have never considered outside investors. Grandfather operated in a different era, I replied carefully. Today's global textile market requires scale and technology that demand significant capital. This investment accelerates our growth while still maintaining family control. My mother's expression remained skeptical. And have you considered how James fits into this new structure? He's been showing renewed interest in the company recently. This was news to me. James hasn't mentioned any interest during our conversations. My brother and I spoke monthly, usually brief catch-up calls where he shared his latest startup adventures, and I provided abbreviated updates on the company. He's been calling me regularly with questions about operations, she countered. He's finally recognizing the value of the family legacy. This investment could complicate his eventual involvement. The implication was clear. My mother still viewed James as the eventual leader of Reynolds Fabrics, despite his years of disinterest and my successful leadership. The investment from Voss would establish a corporate structure with accountability, beyond family preference, making it harder to simply install James whenever my mother deemed appropriate. When the board convened 30 minutes later, I delivered a meticulously prepared presentation outlining the growth opportunity, maintaining a professional demeanor despite my growing realization of what was actually at stake. The objective business case was overwhelming. The investment would transform Reynolds Fabrics from a successful regional manufacturer into a global competitor while maintaining family majority ownership. My Uncle Lawrence, always fiscally conservative, asked pointed questions about investor expectations and exit timelines. The 2 family friends on the board seemed genuinely impressed by both the valuation and the growth strategy. My mother remained largely silent, observing the discussion with an unreadable expression. "This requires careful consideration," she finally stated after my presentation concluded. "We'll need to consult with James since this affects his future inheritance. I suggest we delay any decision until he can participate in the discussion." I had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. The term sheet expires in 2 weeks. Voss has alternative investment targets if we decline. While family consultation is important, this is fundamentally a business decision about company growth. "Perhaps," my mother conceded, "but major structural changes should include all family stakeholders. James will be in town next weekend. We can reconvene then." The meeting adjourned without resolution, though the majority sentiment seemed positive toward the investment. As the others departed, my mother held me back with a gentle touch on my arm. "Catherine, you've done admirable work stabilizing Reynolds. No one questions your management abilities." Her voice carried the particular tone she used when delivering difficult messages wrapped in praise. "But remember that stewardship sometimes means preserving what's essential: family control, independence, legacy, even at the cost of faster growth." I recognized the subtext. My role was stewardship, not ownership. I was caring for something that would eventually pass to James, regardless of my contributions or his qualifications. The investment from Voss threatened this predetermined succession by introducing merit-based governance and external accountability. Driving back to my house that evening, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since those desperate early days of the turnaround. The Voss investment represented more than growth capital. It was a mechanism for securing my position based on performance rather than family politics. But pushing it through would require confronting the unspoken expectations that had always governed Reynolds Fabrics. I made a decision that night that would change everything. If I was going to advocate for this investment and my continued leadership, I needed leverage beyond business results. I needed to secure my position before James arrived for the reconvened board meeting. The next morning, I began implementing a contingency plan that had existed in nascent form since I first registered those patents in my name. Within days, I would either secure my rightful place at Reynolds Fabrics or discover exactly how disposable my mother considered me despite 8 years of transformational leadership. The week following the board meeting unfolded with purpose and precision. While my mother believed I was simply gathering additional information for our postponed decision, I was methodically implementing a strategic plan years in the making. My first call Monday morning was to Caroline Webster, a corporate attorney I had consulted periodically since taking over Reynolds Fabrics. Unlike the family's long-standing legal counsel who reported everything to my mother, Caroline represented my interests exclusively. "I need to formalize several aspects of my relationship with the company," I explained during our breakfast meeting at a quiet cafe downtown. "Specifically, the intellectual property arrangements and my executive contract." Caroline nodded, her expression professional but concerned. "This sounds like you're preparing for a potential separation. Has something changed?" "Not yet," I replied. "But I need to clarify my position before entertaining a significant investment offer." For the next 3 hours, we reviewed my situation comprehensively. The patents I had registered personally and licensed to Reynolds were significant, particularly our proprietary process for embedding recycled carbon fiber into luxury textiles, which had opened the high-end automotive market to us. The licensing agreements, while legally sound, had never been formally approved by the board with proper documentation. "We need to create an official licensing agreement with market rate terms," Caroline advised. "Currently, the company is using your intellectual property under an implied license that's technically revocable. We should establish clear terms that protect both your ownership and the company's usage rights." Next, we addressed my executive contract, or rather, the lack thereof. I had been operating under an informal arrangement established during the crisis period, with compensation far below market value for a CEO who had delivered my results. My position remained technically interim despite 8 years of leadership. This is extraordinarily unusual, Caroline noted, reviewing my compensation history. You've taken minimal salary increases despite transforming the company's performance, and there's no formal employment agreement defining your role, responsibilities, or termination conditions. It evolved that way, I explained. Initially, we couldn't afford proper executive compensation. Later, I prioritized reinvesting in growth rather than adjusting my package. Caroline's expression made her assessment clear. I had allowed family dynamics to create a professionally untenable situation. We need to draft a formal executive employment agreement that reflects your market value and protects your position. The current arrangement leaves you extremely vulnerable. By Wednesday, Caroline had prepared the necessary documentation: a formal licensing agreement for my patents, a comprehensive executive employment contract with appropriate compensation and protection provisions, and a shareholder agreement clarifying voting rights associated with my 25% ownership stake, another arrangement that had remained informal throughout my tenure. Thursday morning, I requested a private meeting with my mother, presenting it as a preliminary discussion before James arrived for the weekend board session. She suggested afternoon tea at her home, a setting she preferred for conversations she wanted to control. The sunroom of my mother's colonial estate offered a deceptively serene environment for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked meticulously maintained gardens, while delicate porcelain teacups and freshly baked scones created an air of civilized refinement. My mother had always excelled at establishing settings that made direct confrontation seem inappropriate. I've been reviewing our corporate structure in preparation for the Voss discussion, I began after initial pleasantries. There are several governance matters we should formalize before entertaining any investment. My mother added a precise half-teaspoon of sugar to her tea. Such as? First, the intellectual property licensing. As you know, several key manufacturing processes are registered under my name and informally licensed to the company. We should establish formal agreements at market-appropriate rates. She set her teacup down with deliberate care. Those innovations were developed using company resources. The current arrangement seems unnecessarily complicated. They were developed primarily through my personal research, often conducted outside normal business hours, I corrected gently. The patents are legally registered in my name, which has actually protected the company by keeping these assets separate from corporate liabilities during our financially vulnerable period. My mother's expression remained impassive, but I noticed the slight tensing of her hands, a tell I recognized from countless negotiations throughout my childhood. She was recalculating her position. Additionally, I continued, after 8 years, we should formalize my executive position with a proper employment agreement. Caroline has prepared a standard contract reflecting market-appropriate terms for a CEO who has achieved our growth metrics. Caroline Webster, my mother noted. You're working with separate counsel rather than Phillips, she observed, referencing the family's attorney. For matters specific to my personal position, yes. It's standard practice to avoid conflicts of interest. My mother studied me with new assessment in her gaze. For perhaps the first time, she was seeing me not as her daughter, but as an executive protecting her professional interests, exactly as she would have done in my position. You've been planning this for some time, she observed, neither a question nor an accusation, simply a recognition. I've been ensuring my contributions to Reynolds are properly documented and protected, I clarified. The potential investment from Voss simply accelerated the timeline for formalizing arrangements that should have been established years ago. And if the board doesn't approve these new agreements? This was the critical question, the moment to reveal the leverage I had carefully accumulated. In that case, I would need to reevaluate my position. The patents would remain my personal property, with licensing subject to new negotiation. And I would need to consider whether Reynolds remains the best platform for my continued professional growth. The implied consequence hung in the air between us. Without those patents, Reynolds would lose its most profitable product lines. Without my leadership, the relationships I had personally cultivated with key clients would be jeopardized. The company could survive without me, but it would immediately forfeit its most significant competitive advantages. My mother sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. After a calculated pause, she asked, "What are you really seeking, Catherine?" "Recognition of my contribution and security in my position," I answered honestly. "I've dedicated 8 years to transforming Reynolds. I've delivered exceptional results by any objective measure. I'm simply asking for the formal acknowledgement and protection any executive in my position would expect." "And James, where does he fit in your vision?" "That depends entirely on his qualifications and contributions, just as my position should depend on mine. If James has developed skills valuable to Reynolds, there could certainly be a role for him. But leadership positions should be earned through demonstrated capability, not inherited through family connection." My mother set her teacup down with finality. "I'll review the documents with Phillips before the board meeting. I assume you've brought copies?" I retrieved the folder from my briefcase, placing it on the table between us. "Everything is here, including market comparisons for the licensing rates and executive compensation." As I drove away from my mother's estate that afternoon, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was the tension of having finally confronted the unspoken family dynamic that had shaped my professional reality for 8 years. There was uncertainty about how my mother would ultimately respond. But beneath these was a surprising sense of liberation. After years of extraordinary effort for minimal recognition, I had finally advocated for my true value. Friday morning, I focused entirely on operational matters, conducting my regular production floor walkthrough, reviewing quality metrics with the manufacturing team, and participating in a design session for our fall collection. These daily responsibilities centered me, reinforcing why I had fought so hard for Reynolds beyond family obligation. I genuinely loved the business we had built, the products we created, the team we had assembled, the impact we had on both our industry and community. Late that afternoon, my assistant informed me that my mother had called requesting my presence at her home that evening, before James arrived and before the scheduled board meeting. This deviation from the established plan could indicate either capitulation or escalation. I arrived at 7, dressed professionally rather than casually as I might normally for a family evening. My mother received me in her study rather than the sunroom or living room, another indication that this was business rather than family discussion. On her desk sat the folder I had provided, now filled with additional documents bearing the letterhead of Phillips Law Group. "Phillips has reviewed everything," she stated without preamble. "The licensing agreements and executive contract are reasonable, with some minor modifications he's noted. The shareholder agreement requires more substantial revision since it interacts with existing family trust structures." I nodded, surprised by her businesslike approach. "I'm open to reasonable adjustments that protect both my interests and the company's." "Before we proceed, I need to understand something," my mother said, studying me with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated employees and business associates throughout her career. "Is this primarily about preventing James from taking a leadership role? Because if so, we should address that directly rather than through legal maneuvering." The question deserved an honest answer. "This is about ensuring that leadership at Reynolds is determined by capability and results, not family succession planning. It's about protecting what I've built from decisions that prioritize tradition over performance. If James has developed the skills to lead effectively, I would support his increased involvement based on merit, not birthright." My mother was quiet for a long moment, seemingly reassessing years of family dynamics and unspoken expectations. "You're more like me than I've acknowledged," she finally said. "I fought similar battles with your grandfather, though with less sophistication than you've shown." This revelation surprised me. My mother had rarely spoken about her early days, leading the company. "What happened?" He expected me to run Reynolds exactly as he had, despite changing market conditions. When I pushed for modernization, he threatened to bring in my cousin instead. I had to leverage the relationships I'd built with key accounts to maintain my position. A small, reminiscent smile crossed her face. I didn't have patents to use as leverage. That was well played. The conversation shifted then, becoming more collegial than adversarial as we reviewed the proposed adjustments to each agreement. By 9 o'clock, we had reached acceptable compromise positions on all substantive issues. The licensing agreements would be formalized at slightly reduced but still market-appropriate rates. My executive contract would include the security provisions I sought with compensation at 90% of the benchmark figures Caroline had proposed. The shareholder agreement would be restructured to work within existing family trust parameters while protecting my voting rights. As I prepared to leave, my mother said something unexpected. "The Voss investment warrants serious consideration. Their expertise in manufacturing modernization could be valuable as we pursue international expansion." This apparent reversal from her previous position caught me off guard. "I agree. Their industry knowledge complements our technical expertise." She nodded. "Prepare a revised presentation for tomorrow's meeting addressing the questions Lawrence raised. I'll ensure James understands the strategic rationale when he arrives tonight." The following morning's board meeting proceeded with surprising efficiency. The licensing agreements, executive contract, and shareholder modifications were approved unanimously, with James abstaining due to his limited familiarity with the details. More significantly, the board voted 4-1 to proceed with the Voss investment, with only my uncle Lawrence dissenting based on his traditional aversion to external financing. As the meeting concluded, my mother made an announcement that fundamentally altered the company's governance structure. "Given Catherine's demonstrated leadership and our new strategic direction, I believe it's appropriate to formalize her position on a permanent basis. I move that we remove the interim designation from her title and establish her as President and CEO of Reynolds Fabrics, effective immediately." The motion passed without opposition, even from Lawrence. James, who had remained largely silent, throughout the meeting offered a surprisingly genuine congratulatory handshake afterward. "Mom showed me the growth numbers last night," he admitted quietly. "I had no idea you'd transformed the company so completely. That was impressive work." By Monday morning, when I called Alexander Voss to officially accept his investment offer, Reynolds Fabrics had been fundamentally transformed, not just financially or operationally, but in its governance and leadership structure. What had begun as a defensive maneuver to protect my position had evolved into a comprehensive modernization of our corporate framework, positioning us for growth beyond anything we could have achieved under the old family dynamics. The company I had rebuilt from near bankruptcy was now poised to become a global competitor, with proper capitalization, professional governance, and leadership based on performance rather than lineage. The journey had required confronting uncomfortable family expectations and advocating for my true value. But the result was a stronger, more sustainable enterprise prepared to thrive in a rapidly evolving industry. The Voss investment transformed Reynolds Fabrics with remarkable speed. Within 6 months of finalizing the deal, we were operating in an entirely new paradigm. The $12 million capital injection funded 3 major initiatives simultaneously: modernizing our primary manufacturing facility with state-of-the-art automated looms and digital printing systems, establishing a European sales office in Milan, and expanding our R&D laboratory for sustainable fiber development. Alexander Voss proved to be far more than a financial partner. He brought operational expertise that complemented our technical knowledge, introducing manufacturing efficiency methodologies that reduced production time by 22% while improving quality metrics. His connections opened doors to luxury automotive, manufacturers in Germany, and high-end furniture producers in Scandinavia, markets we had identified as targets but struggled to penetrate independently. The 2 board seats allocated to Voss Ventures were filled by Alexander himself and Dr. Elise Chambers, a materials scientist who had previously advised several sustainable manufacturing ventures. Dr. Chambers immediately formed a productive relationship with Daniel Merritt, our head of engineering, accelerating our development of carbon-neutral textiles through her extensive research background. My role evolved significantly during this period. With professional management systems now in place and specialized experts handling daily operations, I focused on strategic integration, ensuring our rapid expansion maintained the quality standards and innovative approach that had differentiated Reynolds in the market. Rather than managing crisis after crisis as I had during the turnaround years, I was now leading a coordinated growth strategy across multiple fronts. The company's transformation was perhaps most visible in our new innovation center. We converted a previously underutilized warehouse space adjacent to our main facility into a combined laboratory, design studio, and client experience center. The 15,000 square foot space featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the production floor, creating transparency between research and manufacturing. Design stations equipped with advanced modeling software allowed our team to develop and test new patterns and structures in real time, while the client area showcased our materials in various applications from fashion to automotive interiors. This facility represents the future of American textile manufacturing, Alexander observed during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The integration of design, research, and production capabilities under one roof creates a development cycle measured in weeks rather than months. The Innovation Center quickly became our most effective sales tool. When potential clients visited and witnessed designers collaborating directly with engineers to solve material challenges, they understood our unique value proposition. Orders typically followed within days of these visits, often at premium pricing, due to the customization capabilities we demonstrated. Our workforce expanded to accommodate growing demand, reaching 250 employees by the end of the first year post-investment. Unlike the layoffs that had marked our restructuring period, this growth phase allowed us to be highly selective in our hiring. We developed partnerships with regional technical schools and universities, creating apprenticeship programs that built our talent pipeline while addressing the persistent skills gap in advanced manufacturing. The European operation proved more challenging than anticipated. Cultural differences and regulatory complexities created unexpected obstacles, from certification requirements that varied by country to business relationship expectations that differed markedly from American practices. Our initial sales projections for the region proved overly optimistic, forcing us to adjust our strategy and timelines. Europe is a marathon, not a sprint, Alexander advised during a particularly difficult board meeting where we reviewed disappointing first-quarter European results. Most American companies underestimate the time required to establish credibility in these markets. But once achieved, European client relationships typically last decades rather than years. Following his guidance, we pivoted from a broad market approach to focused relationship building with targeted premium brands. I relocated to Milan for 6 weeks, personally leading our European team through this strategic recalibration. By the end of that period, we had secured development partnerships with 2 Italian luxury furniture manufacturers and a French automotive interiors specialist, smaller wins than originally projected, but with significant long-term potential. Throughout this rapid expansion period, my relationship with my mother evolved in unexpected ways. Her initial resistance to change had given way to cautious enthusiasm as the benefits of professional governance and external expertise became increasingly evident. She remained on the board, but stepped back from operational involvement, finding a new role as company historian and brand ambassador that leveraged her deep industry knowledge while acknowledging the changing leadership dynamic. "You've created something beyond what I imagined possible for Reynolds," she admitted during a rare moment of personal conversation following a board meeting. I had a vision for maintaining what my father built. You had a vision for transforming it entirely. James also found an unexpected place in our expanded organization. After his third startup failed to secure second-round funding, he approached me with uncharacteristic humility about potential opportunities at Reynolds. Rather than the executive position my mother had always envisioned for him, I suggested a role that actually leveraged his technical background, leading our digital integration initiatives. It's not a traditional leadership track, I explained, candidly. But it addresses a critical need as we incorporate more advanced manufacturing technologies. Your computer science background combined with the Reynolds name gives you unique credibility with both our technical team and long-standing clients. To my surprise, James accepted the position with genuine enthusiasm. Free from the expectation of eventually running the entire company, he thrived in a specialized role that matched his actual interests and abilities. Within months, he had implemented a digital tracking system that provided real-time production metrics across all manufacturing processes, significantly improving our operational efficiency. The financial results of our transformation were undeniable. 18 months after the Voss investment, Reynolds Fabrics crossed the $30 million revenue threshold, 10 times what the company had generated when I took over 8 years earlier. More importantly, our profit margins had doubled compared to our pre-investment performance, creating substantial value for all shareholders, including the family trust. We've reached an interesting inflection point, Alexander noted during our quarterly strategy session. Reynolds has successfully transformed from a distressed legacy manufacturer into a growth company with clear market leadership in sustainable luxury textiles. The question now becomes, what's the optimal next step for maximizing long-term value? This seemingly innocuous strategic question opened a conversation that would ultimately force another fundamental reassessment of the company's future and my role within it. The possibilities Alexander outlined included continued organic growth, strategic acquisitions of complementary businesses, or preparation for eventual public offering or strategic sale, each path with significantly different implications for family control and my leadership position. There's no urgency to decide, Alexander assured me, noting my pensive expression. But these options should inform our next phase of strategic planning. Different growth trajectories require different organizational structures and capital strategies. That evening, as I reviewed our latest product development roadmap in my office, I reflected on how thoroughly my professional identity had become intertwined with Reynolds Fabrics. The company had evolved from a burden I reluctantly assumed, out of family obligation, into a creative expression of my vision for modern American manufacturing. The prospect of potentially separating from it through any exit scenario, even one that would generate significant personal wealth, created an unexpected emotional conflict. My contemplation was interrupted by a call from my mother. "I'd like you to join me for dinner tomorrow evening," she said without preamble. "There's a matter I need to discuss before the next board meeting." The formal tone immediately put me on alert. "Is everything all right?" "Nothing urgent," she assured me. "Just something that should be addressed privately before becoming a board discussion." I agreed to meet her at Castellanos, an upscale Italian restaurant that had been a family favorite for important occasions since my childhood. The choice of venue itself suggested significance. My mother reserved Castellanos for conversations she considered momentous, from college decisions to my broken engagement years earlier. When I arrived the following evening, I found my mother, already seated at her preferred corner table, a glass of Barolo at her place, and a second waiting for me. She looked particularly elegant in a navy dress I recognized from important business functions, her silver hair styled more formally than usual for a family dinner. "You're looking well," she observed as I took my seat. "The European expansion seems to agree with you, despite the challenges." "It's been educational," I acknowledged. "Their approach to textile quality and sustainability is decades ahead of American standards in many respects." We maintained pleasant conversation through the appetizer course, discussing industry developments and family matters with the practiced ease of business colleagues who happened to be related. Only after our entrees were served did my mother transition to the actual purpose of our meeting. "The Voss partnership has exceeded expectations," she began, carefully cutting her veal marsala. "Alexander's expertise has proven valuable, and the capital has enabled growth we couldn't have achieved independently." I nodded, waiting for the qualification that typically followed such praise. "The board will soon need to consider the scenarios Alexander outlined regarding our next growth phase," she continued. "Before that discussion occurs, I wanted to share something with you privately." She set down her utensils and reached for her handbag, removing a sealed envelope that she placed on the table between us. "These are the original articles of incorporation for Reynolds Textiles, as my father established it in 1953. There's a provision I believe you should be aware of." I opened the envelope with curiosity, unfolding yellowed papers protected in a clear preservation sleeve. The document was typed on formal legal stationery, with multiple signatures in faded ink at the bottom. "Article 4, Section 3, my mother directed." I located the referenced section and read aloud. "Leadership of Reynolds Textiles shall remain with the Reynolds family in perpetuity, with preference given to direct descendants who have demonstrated commitment to company welfare and industry excellence." My father included that provision specifically to prevent external interests from gaining control through investment or acquisition, my mother explained. He believed family businesses maintained quality standards and community commitments that publicly traded companies could not. I considered the implications of this founding principle in light of our current strategic crossroads. This seems to limit our options considerably regarding any public offering scenario. "Not necessarily," my mother replied, surprising me. "Legal structures evolve, and principles can be honored through various governance mechanisms. What matters is the underlying intent, maintaining leadership that prioritizes quality, innovation, and community impact over short-term financial metrics." She took a deliberate sip of her wine before continuing. "I've come to recognize that family leadership should be defined by values and commitment rather than merely bloodline. You've demonstrated those qualities more consistently than anyone in our company's history, including myself." This admission from my typically reserved mother momentarily left me speechless. She used my silence to continue. "Whatever strategic direction the board ultimately recommends, I wanted you to know that I will support maintaining your leadership position. Not because you're my daughter, but because you've proven yourself the most capable steward of what Reynolds represents at its best." The conversation marked a profound shift in our relationship, an acknowledgement that my value to Reynolds transcended family obligation and extended to professional leadership based on demonstrated capability. This recognition, after years of implied temporariness in my role, carried emotional significance beyond its practical implications for company governance. As we finished dinner and prepared to leave, my mother added one final thought. "Your grandfather would have initially resisted the changes you've implemented, just as I did. But he would have ultimately recognized what I've come to see, that preserving a legacy sometimes requires reimagining it entirely." That dinner conversation, seemingly focused on corporate governance, represented the true culmination of my transformation from reluctant family duty-bearer to recognized industry leader. The validation came not from financial metrics or market recognition, though those had been substantial, but from the acknowledgement that I had honored the essential spirit of Reynolds while completely reinventing its expression for a new era. The next phase of growth would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but I would face them with the confidence that came from both external success and internal recognition. A combination that had seemed impossibly distant during those desperate early days of the turnaround. The second anniversary of the Voss investment marked a significant milestone for Reynolds Fabrics. We hosted a celebration at our headquarters, transforming the main atrium into an exhibition space, showcasing our journey from traditional textile manufacturer to industry innovator. Display panels chronicled our evolution through fabric samples, revenue charts, and photographs of key moments. The event brought together employees, clients, industry partners, and community leaders, a visible demonstration of how far we had come. From near bankruptcy to industry leadership in less than a decade, Alexander observed as we surveyed the gathering from a mezzanine overlooking the atrium. That's a transformation story few manufacturing companies can claim, particularly in the textile sector. The metrics supported his assessment. Revenue had reached $38 million annually, with projections indicating we would cross the $45 million threshold by year-end. Our workforce had grown to nearly 280 employees across our main facility, innovation center, and European office. Most significantly, our sustainable luxury textiles now appeared in products from 17 global brands, including 3 premium automotive manufacturers and several high-end furniture producers. Yet beneath this visible success, subtle shifts were occurring that would eventually reshape both Reynolds Fabrics and my role within it. The first indication came during our quarterly board meeting following the anniversary celebration. Alexander, typically focused on operational improvements and growth strategies, unexpectedly raised the topic of corporate structure. Reynolds has matured significantly as an organization, he noted while reviewing our latest financial results. However, our governance and management systems haven't evolved at the same pace as our operational capabilities. We should consider whether our current structure optimally supports our next growth phase. The suggestion seemed innocuous, a standard consideration for growing companies. Yet something in Alexander's tone and the carefully neutral expression of Dr. Chambers, his fellow Voss representative on our board, triggered a subtle warning in my mind. After years of negotiating complex situations, I had developed an instinct for when seemingly routine business discussions concealed deeper agendas. What specific aspects of our structure would you recommend evaluating? I asked, maintaining a collegial tone while watching closely for reactions. Several areas merit review, Alexander replied smoothly. Our decision-making processes often favor consensus over efficiency. Our departmental structure reflects historical divisions rather than current operational needs, and our executive team could benefit from specialized expertise in areas like international compliance and advanced manufacturing technologies. My mother, who had remained largely silent during recent board meetings, looked up sharply at this last point. Are you suggesting changes to our leadership team? Not necessarily changes, Alexander clarified. More likely additions and role refinements to support Catherine as we scale. Leading a $40 million global operation requires different support systems than running a $15 million regional business. The conversation moved on to other topics, but the seed had been planted. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in communication patterns. Alexander began scheduling separate meetings with department heads, rather than channeling all strategic discussions through me as had been our practice. Dr. Chambers spent increasing time with our R&D team, sometimes making technical suggestions that weren't fully aligned with our established product roadmap. Most tellingly, Voss Ventures sent a strategic operations consultant named Marcus Whitfield to conduct what was described as a systems efficiency review. Marcus, with his precise British accent and background at a prestigious management consulting firm, embedded himself throughout our organization, interviewing managers, observing processes, and collecting data on decision flows and reporting relationships. Standard procedure for this growth stage, Alexander assured me when I inquired about the expanded scope of the review. Marcus has helped several of our portfolio companies optimize their organizational structure for scale. His recommendations have consistently improved operational efficiency. While plausible on the surface, the timing and comprehensive nature of the assessment suggested a more significant agenda. I maintained a cooperative posture publicly while privately increasing my vigilance. During this period, I made a point of spending more time on our production floor, reinforcing personal connections with the supervisors and lead operators who formed the backbone of our manufacturing capability. I also accelerated several key client meetings, ensuring that our most important relationships remained firmly connected to my personal leadership rather than institutional processes. James was the first to voice explicit concerns. During our now regular Friday afternoon debriefs, a practice we had established as his role in digital integration expanded, he mentioned observations that had initially seemed unrelated. Marcus has been asking very specific questions about decision authority and approval processes, he noted, particularly regarding product development timelines and client relationship management. It feels less like an efficiency review and more like a leadership assessment. Coming from James, who had historically been oblivious to organizational politics, this observation carried particular weight. "Has he spoken with you about your role specifically?" I asked. "Not directly," James replied, "but he's spent considerable time mapping the technology integration initiatives and asking who besides me could lead them if necessary. The implication being that I might be moved to different responsibilities." This detail crystallized my growing suspicion. Voss was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of Reynolds's leadership structure with an eye toward significant reorganization. The question became whether this represented standard portfolio company, management, or something more targeted at my position specifically. My answer came unexpectedly during an industry conference in Chicago. I had delivered a keynote address on sustainable manufacturing innovations, representing Reynolds to a gathering of textile industry leaders. Following my presentation, I encountered Elise Chambers at the reception, separated for once from the usual Voss contingent. After exchanging pleasantries about the conference, Dr. Chambers mentioned casually, "I had dinner with Robert Kessler last week when he visited our Boston office. He spoke very highly of your manufacturing innovations." The comment seemed innocuous until I processed the name. Robert Kessler was CEO of Meridian Textiles, one of our primary competitors, and a company that had previously approached us about acquisition possibilities before the Voss investment. More significantly, he had no obvious reason to be meeting with Voss Ventures unless they were exploring strategic relationships. "Robert is always generous with professional compliments," I responded neutrally. "Was he in Boston specifically to meet with Voss?" A flicker of recognition crossed Dr. Chambers' face as she realized her casual comment had revealed more than intended. "Among other meetings," she recovered smoothly. "Boston's quite the hub for textile innovation these days." The exchange lasted only moments, but it confirmed what the patterns had been suggesting. Voss was exploring strategic options for Reynolds that potentially included partnership with or acquisition by competitors. Such discussions would typically involve the CEO unless they were specifically considering leadership changes as part of any transaction. Rather than confronting Alexander directly, which would likely yield carefully constructed explanations, I decided to gather more comprehensive information. The following morning, I called Caroline Webster, the attorney who had helped structure my executive agreement and patent licensing. "I need a complete review of my position under various potential company scenarios," I explained. "Particularly, my rights and obligations in case of acquisition, merger, or significant reorganization." Caroline, perceptive as always, immediately understood the subtext. "Has Voss initiated transaction discussions without your involvement?" "I believe they're exploring options that might include leadership changes," I replied. "I need to understand my leverage if that's the case." The assessment Caroline provided 3 days later was both reassuring and concerning. My executive contract included strong protection against arbitrary removal, requiring performance-based justification for any termination. The patent licensing agreements remained individually controlled, meaning any acquirer would need my cooperation to maintain access to our most valuable intellectual property. However, Certain reorganization scenarios could substantively change my authority while technically maintaining my position, effectively sidelining me without triggering protection clauses. The agreements are strong but not comprehensive regarding organizational restructuring, Caroline concluded. They protect against removal, but not necessarily marginalization through authority dilution. Armed with this understanding, I began systematic preparation for what increasingly appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. First, I documented all key strategic initiatives currently underway, clearly establishing my leadership role and critical contribution to each. Second, I accelerated patent filings on 3 new manufacturing processes developed through our Innovation Center, ensuring they followed the established pattern of personal ownership with company licensing. Finally, I prepared detailed performance metrics demonstrating the company's exceptional growth under my leadership compared to industry averages and similar Voss portfolio companies. The catalyst came sooner than expected. During a routine executive committee meeting, Alexander announced that Marcus Whitfield had completed his organizational assessment and would present recommendations at the next board meeting. The presentation would include a proposed executive structure optimization to support our international growth objectives. I've reviewed his preliminary findings, Alexander added. His recommendations represent best practices from similar-sized manufacturing organizations focusing on global expansion. I'd appreciate seeing these recommendations before the board presentation, I responded evenly. As CEO, I should have the opportunity to provide input on any proposed organizational changes. Alexander's slight hesitation before responding spoke volumes. Of course, Marcus can schedule a preview session later this week. That preview session revealed the full scope of Voss's intentions. The proposed reorganization would create a new executive layer, a chief operating officer who would oversee all manufacturing, supply chain, and product development functions, reporting to me but with significant autonomous authority. 3 additional executive positions would be established at equal level to my current direct reports, effectively diluting my span of control. Most tellingly, the proposed COO role had a draft position profile attached that described qualifications, remarkably well suited to a former Meridian Textiles executive who had recently left that company. These changes would fundamentally alter the leadership structure that has delivered exceptional results, I observed after reviewing the full proposal. What specific problems is this reorganization designed to address? Marcus, clearly uncomfortable with direct confrontation, deferred to Alexander. It's not about problems, Alexander explained smoothly. It's about building infrastructure for the next growth phase. The current structure has served Reynolds well during transformation, but global scale requires more specialized executive functions. And the timing of these changes, they seem quite comprehensive to implement simultaneously. We believe a coordinated reorganization creates less disruption than incremental adjustments, Alexander replied. The board presentation will include a phased implementation timeline to manage the transition effectively. I maintained professional composure throughout the meeting, while inwardly resolving that this proposed reorganization, clearly designed to systematically reduce my authority while maintaining the appearance of my leadership, would never be implemented as presented. The question became not whether to resist, but how to do so most effectively. That evening, I called my mother, requesting a private discussion before the board meeting. We met at her home the following morning, where I presented the reorganization proposal along with my assessment of its implications. This is a sophisticated marginalization strategy, I explained. Create a structure where I remain CEO in title, but with progressively reduced operational control. Eventually, my role becomes sufficiently limited that stepping aside seems logical rather than confrontational. My mother reviewed the documents with the shrewd, analytical eye that had once intimidated industry competitors. Alexander is more political than I initially assessed, she observed. The question is whether this represents standard Voss portfolio. management, or specific dissatisfaction with your leadership? I believe it's preparation for a potential transaction, I replied. These structural changes would make Reynolds more compatible with Meridian's organization in case of acquisition or merger. They've been having discussions with Robert Kessler. My mother's expression hardened at this revelation. Without board notification? That would violate our investment agreement. Exploratory conversations might not technically trigger disclosure requirements, but combined with this reorganization proposal, the direction seems clear. For several moments, my mother was silent, processing the implications with the strategic calculation that had marked her own business career. "What do you plan to do?" she finally asked. "Prevent implementation of this specific proposal while offering a reasonable alternative that addresses legitimate scaling needs," I replied. "But I need to understand whether I have your support as a board member and majority shareholder." My mother's response was immediate and unequivocal. The Reynolds family built this company through 3 generations. We accepted Voss's investment for growth capital, not to surrender control of our legacy. You have my complete support. With this critical alliance secured, I began preparing for a board confrontation that would determine not just my leadership future, but the fundamental direction of Reynolds Fabrics. The company I had rebuilt from near failure was approaching a crossroads that would test everything I had learned about strategic leverage, organizational politics, and the delicate balance between partnership and control. With my mother's support secured, I had 5 days before the board meeting to develop a comprehensive counter-strategy. Rather than working from my office where my actions might be observed, I set up operations in my home study, transforming the space into a command center for what had become a battle for Reynolds' future. I cleared my schedule of non-essential meetings, delegating routine matters to my executive team while citing an intensive strategic planning project as the reason for my temporary withdrawal. My approach required careful calibration. I needed to defend my position without appearing defensive, offer constructive alternatives while rejecting the problematic proposal, and maintain professional relationships despite what had become an adversarial situation. Above all, I needed leverage beyond my executive authority to ensure my perspective prevailed. I began by conducting a comprehensive assessment of our current organization, documenting with precise metrics how our existing structure had delivered exceptional results. Revenue had grown at 42% annually under my leadership compared to the industry average of 7%. Employee retention stood at 94% versus the manufacturing sector average of 76%. Our sustainable textiles commanded price premiums averaging 28% above competitors' comparable products. This performance analysis created an evidence-based foundation for questioning any radical structural changes. Next, I developed an alternative, organizational evolution that addressed legitimate scaling needs while preserving clear leadership channels. Rather than inserting a COO layer between myself and core operations, my plan created specialized leadership roles for European expansion and advanced manufacturing technologies, areas where additional expertise would genuinely benefit our growth trajectory. This alternative maintained direct reporting relationships for critical functions, while adding specialized capability where most valuable. The third component involved a comprehensive stakeholder analysis. I mapped key relationships throughout Reynolds and systematically reinforced critical connections. I conducted one-on-one conversations with department heads, ostensibly to discuss quarterly objectives, but actually to gauge their perspectives on the organizational assessment and subtly secure their alignment. I personally visited our production floor during all 3 shifts, connecting with supervisors and line operators who formed the backbone of our manufacturing capability. Most importantly, I activated my network of external relationships. I scheduled calls with our 5 largest clients, reinforcing their direct connection to my leadership and our commitment to their specific priorities. These conversations served dual purposes: strengthening important business relationships while establishing that key revenue streams were personally linked to my leadership approach. Caroline Webster provided invaluable guidance on leveraging my legal position. Your executive agreement requires board approval for any substantive change to your responsibilities or reporting relationships, she confirmed after detailed review. This gives you procedural protection against implementation without proper governance. The patent licensing agreements provided additional leverage. While the arrangements allowed Reynolds to use my innovations, significant organizational changes could potentially trigger renegotiation clauses. These aren't nuclear options, Caroline advised, but they create constraints that must be considered in any restructuring decision. Throughout this preparation period, I maintained normal professional interactions with Alexander and the Voss team, giving no indication of my comprehensive counter-strategy. When Marcus requested additional information for finalizing his presentation, I provided it promptly and thoroughly. When Alexander suggested a pre-board dinner to discuss quarterly results, I accepted graciously. This approach preserved working relationships while allowing me to fully prepare my position. 3 days before the board meeting, I received an unexpected call from James. Marcus just interviewed me again, he reported. He asked specifically about succession planning and whether I'd be interested in expanding my role beyond technology integration. This information confirmed my suspicions about the breadth of Voss's reorganization intentions. What did you tell him? I asked. That I'm fully committed to my current responsibilities and believe the company benefits most from your continued leadership, James replied. I also mentioned that our family values stability and consistent direction. My brother's support, coming without solicitation, represented a gratifying evolution in our relationship. The crisis had revealed James as an ally rather than a competitor, a transformation neither of us could have anticipated during our earlier years of strained interactions. The day before the board meeting, I conducted final preparations with methodical precision. I rehearsed my presentation multiple times, refining key points and anticipating potential objections. I prepared comprehensive documentation supporting each assertion and recommendation. I even planned my attire strategically, choosing a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority while avoiding unnecessary aggression through color or styling. That evening, I invited Daniel Merritt to my home for dinner. As our head of engineering and a 5% equity holder from the early turnaround days, Daniel represented a critical voice in any organizational discussion. More importantly, his technical expertise had created many of our most valuable innovations, making him essential to future development regardless of leadership structure. Voss is positioning for a potential transaction with Meridian, I explained after sharing the reorganization proposal. This structure would make integration more seamless if that's their ultimate objective. Daniel studied the documents with the analytical focus he typically applied to engineering challenges. This dilutes decision authority significantly, he observed. Innovation would inevitably slow with these additional approval layers. My concern exactly. I've developed an alternative that addresses scaling needs without compromising our innovative agility. The question is whether I can secure sufficient board support to implement it instead. Daniel looked up from the papers, his expression unusually determined for someone typically focused on technical matters rather than organizational politics. Reynolds's success comes from your leadership approach and our technical capabilities, working in alignment. Disrupting that dynamic would undermine everything we've built. His perspective reinforced my conviction that this confrontation transcended personal career concerns. It represented a fundamental choice about Reynolds's future identity and capabilities. The company's continued success depended on maintaining the leadership approach and innovation culture that had driven its transformation. The morning of the board meeting arrived with crystalline clarity. As I drove to our headquarters, I felt an unusual calm, the focused readiness that comes from comprehensive preparation combined with absolute conviction. The issues at stake extended beyond my personal position to encompass the future of an organization that now employed nearly 300 people, supported numerous supplier businesses, and created products that represented American manufacturing excellence. I arrived early, setting up my materials in the boardroom and reviewing my key points one final time. Board members arrived gradually. First, my Uncle Lawrence, always punctually early. Then the two independent directors who had joined following. The Voss investment. Then my mother, who gave me a subtle nod of solidarity as she took her seat. Alexander and Dr. Chambers arrived together, followed by Marcus Whitfield with an oversized portfolio containing his presentation materials. As chair of the board, my mother called the meeting to order precisely on schedule. After handling routine governance matters, she introduced the main agenda item, Organizational Structure Assessment and Recommendations, inviting Marcus to present his findings. For the next 40 minutes, Marcus delivered a thoroughly professional analysis of Reynolds's current organization, comparing our structure to supposed industry benchmarks and identifying what he termed opportunity areas for optimization. His presentation was polished, data-rich, and superficially compelling, particularly for board members without deep operational experience in manufacturing environments. The proposed reorganization was presented as a natural evolution for a growing company rather than the fundamental restructuring it actually represented. The COO role was described as support for the CEO, rather than an intermediary layer. The additional executive positions were framed as specialized expertise, rather than dilution of existing authority channels. Throughout, Marcus emphasized how these changes represented best practices from companies at similar growth stages. When he concluded, Alexander smoothly transitioned to implementation discussion. We believe these structural improvements can be initiated immediately, with full implementation over approximately 90 days. Recruiting for the new executive roles could begin next week, with the COO position our top priority. The presumption of board approval without substantive discussion was telling. Alexander clearly anticipated the recommendations would be accepted with minimal debate, positioning implementation as the only real topic requiring consideration. Before discussing implementation, my mother interjected, I believe we should hear Catherine's perspective on these recommendations, given her role as CEO and her successful leadership of Reynolds's transformation. Alexander nodded with practiced cordiality. Of course. Catherine, we welcome your thoughts on the transition timeline. Actually, I replied, rising from my seat, I'd like to address the fundamental recommendations themselves rather than just implementation timing. For the next 30 minutes, I presented a comprehensive assessment that systematically dismantled the case for the proposed reorganization while offering a more appropriate alternative. I began with performance metrics demonstrating the exceptional results our current structure had delivered, establishing a high burden of proof for any radical changes. I analyzed specific elements of the proposal, identifying how they would create decision bottlenecks rather than enhancing efficiency. Most effectively, I presented direct client testimonials gathered during my recent outreach, statements from our largest customers emphasizing the value they placed on our responsive decision-making and innovation agility. These external validations proved particularly powerful in countering the theoretical best practices Marcus had cited. While I agree that our organization must evolve as we grow, I concluded, that evolution should enhance, rather than compromise, the qualities that have driven our success. The alternative structure I'm proposing addresses legitimate scaling needs while preserving our decision agility and innovation culture. I distributed detailed documentation of my alternative organizational development plan to each board member, unlike the Voss proposal, which inserted new layers between existing functions. My approach added specialized expertise where genuinely beneficial while maintaining direct connection between leadership and core operations. As board discussion began, the dynamics I had carefully cultivated through preparation became evident. The independent directors, initially inclined toward the Voss recommendations based on their supposed alignment with industry standards, now asked increasingly skeptical questions about implementation risks and client impact. My uncle Lawrence, typically conservative regarding organizational changes, expressed concerns about disrupting our successful operational model. My mother maintained her role as objective chair while ensuring full discussion of both proposals. When Alexander attempted to reframe the conversation around implementation timing rather than fundamental approach, my mother firmly redirected the discussion. The board needs to make a clear decision between these alternative organizational directions before addressing implementation details. The deliberation continued for nearly 2 hours, with perspectives gradually converging toward a modified version of my proposal. By meeting's end, the board voted 5-2 to implement my organizational evolution plan rather than the Voss restructuring, with only Alexander and Dr. Chambers dissenting. As the meeting concluded, Alexander approached me with the calculated pleasantness of someone recalibrating after a strategic setback. "You made a compelling case for your approach," he acknowledged, "though I still believe more substantial structural changes will eventually be necessary as Reynolds continues scaling." "I appreciate your perspective," I replied with equal professional courtesy. My priority remains building on Reynolds' successful formula while evolving appropriately for future growth. I'm confident the approved plan achieves that balance. The exchange maintained superficial collegiality while we both recognized the fundamental shift that had occurred. Voss had attempted a significant governance move and failed. The implications for our ongoing partnership would unfold over coming months, but the immediate result was clear. I had successfully defended my leadership approach and Reynolds' organizational integrity against a sophisticated marginalization attempt. That evening, as I drove home through the gathering dusk, I reflected on how thoroughly I had transformed from the reluctant interim leader who had returned to save a failing family business. 8 years of crisis management, strategic decisions, and organizational leadership had developed capabilities I never knew I possessed. Most importantly, I had learned that professional value must be claimed and defended rather than simply demonstrated, a lesson that would prove essential during the unexpected challenges still to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.